Some songs don't feel like they were written so much as arrived at. Not in a sudden flash of inspiration, nor written in a burst of clarity, but gradually, almost reluctantly, as if they had to be pulled into the world piece by piece. You can hear that process in them, the artist's hesitation. In this, there is a sense that the musician singing is still trying to understand what it is they're feeling, even as the tape is rolling. Those kinds of songs tend to stay with you longer. They don't resolve cleanly, and they don't try and guide you towards a conclusion. Instead, they leave space, room for something unsettled, something unfinished. You don't just listen to them once and move on. You return to them, sometimes years later, and they sound a little different each time. Big Bird by Eddie Floyd is one of those songs. It carries the weight of a moment that couldn't be explained at the time it happened. It still resists explanation now. What it offers instead is something quieter, but maybe more lasting. A sense of being inside that moment, without distance, without commentary, and without the comfort of hindsight. It's a song suspended between earth and sky, between what was and what can never be again. A song that carries grief not as a dramatic outburst, but as a quiet, persistent ache that never quite leaves. This is Big Bird. To understand where that feeling comes from, you have to go back to late 1967, into the presence of Otis Redding. Redding's voice had a way of cutting through everything around it. Not because it was loud, although it certainly could be, but because it felt anchored in something real. There was no distance between the emotion and the delivery. When he leaned into a line, you believed him, without needing to think about why. At Stax Records, that kind of honesty wasn't unusual. See, the entire operation had been built on it. The studio itself, a converted movie theater in Memphis, wasn't designed for perfection. It was designed for feel, for capturing something immediate before it slipped away, and Redding thrived in that environment. He worked closely with musicians from Booker T and the MGs, along with a rotating cast of horn players and collaborators who understood instinctively how to support a song without overcomplicating it. There was a shared language in those sessions, something that didn't need to be spelled out. Redding wasn't just part of that world, he helped define it. On December 10th, 1967, he boarded a small plane bound for Madison, Wisconsin, along with key members of his touring band, the Barkays. The details of what happened next are brief and devastating. The plane went down over Lake Monona. There were no long accounts, no drawn-out aftermath, just the abruptness of it. The kind of ending that doesn't give anyone time to prepare for what comes after. Back in Memphis, the loss settled in slowly, almost unevenly. It wasn't just grief in the abstract, it was the absence of someone who had been part of the daily rhythm of making music, of building something together. You could feel it in the studio, in the silence between takes, the way conversations just trailed off. For Stax stalwart and Redding collaborator Eddie Floyd, that absence was impossible to ignore. Eddie Floyd's life traces its steady rise from Montgomery to Detroit, from a reform school choir in the heart of the emerging soul scene, setting the stage for his breakthrough at Stax just before Otis Redding's death in 1967. By the time Eddie Floyd was 16, he wasn't just dreaming about music, he was already building it. He and a few Detroit friends put together a little group called the Falcons, and somehow this teenage outfit ended up helping invent a sound we now call early soul. They weren't supposed to be pioneers, but that's how it goes sometimes. One minute you're harmonizing in a living room, and the next you've got a national hit with You're So Fine. And when Wilson Pickett walked in and took over lead vocals, the whole thing caught fire again with I Found Love. But like a lot of the early soul stories, the Falcons didn't last. By the early 60s, the group had scattered. Eddie drifted for a bit and spent some time in Washington, D.C., figuring out what came next, until a friend with a good eye for talent, Al Bell, said essentially, "Come to Memphis. There's something happening here." And there was. In 1965, Eddie walked into Stax Records as a songwriter, not a star. But he didn't stay in the background for very long. He was writing for Carla Thomas, tossing ideas back and forth with Steve Cooper, and crafting songs for his old bandmate Wilson Pickett. Songs like 99 and a half Won't Do and 6345789, which would become staples of the soul canon. Then came the twist. Eddie and Cooper wrote a tune meant for Otis Redding. Eddie cut the demo, and Stax decided that the demo was the record. Knock on Wood hit in 1966, and suddenly, Eddie Floyd wasn't just the guy between the songs, he was the voice out front.
I don't want to lose this good thing that I've got.
So by the time Otis Redding died in December 1967, Eddie Floyd had already carved out his place in the Stax universe. All the pieces of his early life, Montgomery Grit, Detroit schooling, the Reform School Choir, the Falcons, the writing rooms in Memphis, had fused into something unmistakable. He wasn't just a part of the Southern soul story, he was one of the artists shaping it in real time. Floyd worked alongside Redding in ways that went beyond casual collaboration. They had written together, they had shaped songs together, and there was a kind of understanding that develops in those situations, something that's hard to describe but easy to recognize when it's gone. Not long after Redding's death, Floyd found himself on a flight back to Memphis. It was one of those moments that seems almost too on the nose, but it's real. The songwriter in the air, looking down on the landscape he knows so well, trying to reconcile what has changed and what hasn't. From the window, the Mississippi River stretched out below, steady and familiar, moving in the same way it always had. The land hadn't shifted, the city hadn't disappeared, and yet the sense of orientation, the feeling of knowing where you stood within it, had been altered. Grief does that. It doesn't rearrange the world, it rearranges your place inside it. Somewhere in that quiet, suspended stretch of time, the first lines of Big Bird began to take shape.
Open up the sky, 'cause I'm coming up to you. So send down your wings and let them bring me to you. You know I'm standing at...
Big Bird was recorded at Stax Studios in Memphis, Tennessee. The studio itself carried a physical character that shaped everything recorded there. The wooden floors, open spaces, and an acoustically imperfect room that gave the music its immediacy. Nothing sounded overly polished, and everything sounded present. The sessions feature musicians from Booker T and the MGs. On guitar, Steve Cooper plays with restraint, offering small, precise phrases that leave room rather than filling it. Holding down the bass, the understated and masterful Donald Tuck Dunn provides a steady undercurrent, never drawing attention away from the vocal, but constantly shaping its movement. On drums, of course, Al Jackson Jr. He anchors the track with understated control, allowing the groove to breathe without losing cohesion. Then there's those horns. They enter like weather patterns rather than accents, slow, swelling, and receding in waves rather than punctuating with sharp hits. Nothing in the arrangement feels excessive. Everything feels intentional in its restraint. Floyd's vocal performance sits at the center of the track with a quiet tension. He never pushes into full release. Instead, he holds the emotional center of the song just below the surface, allowing the strain to appear only in small amounts, slight tightening at the ends of phrases, subtle hesitation before returning to the refrain.
I'm trusting your soul. Get on up, Big Bird, to my baby love. Get on up, Big Bird, to my baby love. Get on up, Big Bird, 'cause I got to make it there. Just get on up, Big Bird, 'cause I got to make it.
It creates a sense that the song is always on the edge of breaking open, but chooses not to. When Big Bird was released in 1968, it did not immediately find widespread commercial success. It wasn't designed for impact in the conventional sense. It didn't rely on a sharp hook or defining moment meant to seize attention on the first listen. Its recognition came slowly. To understand its lasting presence, it helps to view it within the broader legacy of Stax Records. Stax helped establish a musical language that prioritized emotional authenticity over technical perfection. That approach didn't stay confined to its era. It became part of that larger tradition that is American music. And later soul and R&B, you hear echoes of that philosophy in its willingness to let vulnerability sit unprotected in the edge of performance. Songs became places where grief, love, and uncertainty could exist without needing resolution. That influence extends further into hip-hop, where entire bodies of work are often built around processing a memory and loss in real time, sometimes through direct storytelling and sometimes through abstraction, but always rooted in the idea that lived experience itself can be the subject of music. Big Bird exists near the beginning of that continuum. It doesn't frame grief as something to overcome. It doesn't shape it into a narrative closure. It allows it to remain unresolved, which is precisely what gives it its longevity. Over time, listeners have returned to the song not because it reveals itself quickly, but because it reveals itself slowly. Each listen feels like a different encounter with the same emotional space. What makes Big Bird endure is not resolution, but recognition. It doesn't offer an answer to loss. It simply inhabits it. And in doing so, it leaves room for listeners to do the same. Before we close out, how about a little Stax session player trivia? Before becoming the house band at Stax, a future member of Booker T and the MGs originally joined the group as a replacement musician during an early recording session, only to become essential to that band's signature sound. That musician was none other than Donald Duck Dunn, who stepped in on bass after Louis Steinberg and eventually became the group's longtime bassist. Steinberg was the group's original bassist and played on early classics like Green Onions and the album Soul Dressing. According to accounts from musicians close to the band, Steinberg's style leaned towards traditional blues-based bass lines, while the MGs were moving towards a more aggressive, syncopated, and modern soul sound, especially as they became the core studio band behind Otis Redding and other legendary Stax artists. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of listener this show is for. And if this episode meant something to you, pass it along, because these songs only stay alive if we keep talking about them. Keep your ears open and your mind curious. This has been Dustbin Prophecies. And if you'd like to hear the song we featured in tonight's episode, or any of the songs you've heard on earlier episodes of the podcast, check out our curated playlist to hear all of them. And of course, if you like what you hear on the show, leave us a review, and don't forget to subscribe to get all future episodes wherever you hear your favorite podcasts. And thank you.